Jeff Rolfing here, all the way from Michigan, towed a boat to, guess what kind, and is here to talk about the history of Boston Whaler. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank
you.
Good to have you, Jeff. Thank you for having me over again. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you coming. Whaler is a passion of mine. It's been that way ever since I was a kid. I grew up on the water. I grew up with Boston Whalers. I think pretty much everybody who is here, if you're here, you've had those indelible moments on these boats. And I think that's one of the unique things about this brand. There are so few brands that exist out there today that made boats back in the early 60s, late 50s, and are still making boats today. I grew up on whalers. The first boat that I had was a 15-foot Boston Whaler Super Sport. We had larger boats. We never had cottages, so I grew up in marinas, on cruisers, sleeping on those, and I had an inflatable, and all of the rich kids in the marina, they all had whalers. So I always wanted one when I was a kid, and my dad surprised me. I remember it was a snowy morning in February. He said, so I found this ad, and at the time, Boat US had a magazine that had listings in it. It's like, I found an ad for a whaler, do you want to go get it with me this weekend? And I was like, absolutely. So that was 92, and we drove like 6-7 hours down to the border of Kentucky and Indiana and got this boat. And it was a lifelong passion of mine. Like, even before I had this boat, I would go to the boat shows, I would get the catalogs, I would read them cover to cover until they were falling apart, and then following year go get my new catalog for the next year. Upgraded to a Montauk, and then, you know, this is just a passion of mine since I've been growing up. I drew whalers when I was a kid in study hall instead of actually doing homework. So that's just kind of the passion that I've had around this brand for all of these years. I was lucky enough, my dad, he jokingly said, told my brother and I, he sold the 15 because we were not driving it responsibly. We would go out and we would jump wakes, we would go out in Lake Huron and jump it and drive as hard as we could. It was really just too small for everybody. And again, he surprised us a year later and got a Montauk. Stopped, he was with my mom on the side of the road in Port Huron, Michigan, and just had to look at the boat. One thing led to another, and we ended up having that boat for many years. You know, those indelible moments still live on today. The boat that I have out here, I hauled from Michigan. It's something that my son and I restored. We live on the water. This is something that we have in our backyard on a hoist, and my son, as well as my daughter, you can see just the smile on her face. That's one thing that these boats do. They bring out excitement, passion, and just a love for the water that you can't find anywhere. A lot of the people here today are from my community. I have over 60,000 people, both on Facebook and Instagram, that follow me. And it's really following the whaler community. We put on whaler events in the Great Lakes. I'm doing one next month down in South Carolina. We routinely get anywhere from like 15 to 30, 40 boats in South Carolina. I think we're going to have almost 100 people. So the community around these boats is tremendous, and it really is because of the longevity that this brand has had and the connection that it's developed around the people. You know, when I say it is the first boat, last boat, these boats still exist today that somebody can go out for $500 to $1,000, buy a beat-up 13, restore it, and they're on the water. And that brand and that boat will live within their memory until they retire. And for me, yes, you know, when I retire, I'll probably end up with another whaler as well. So it's something that you're able to, the brand touches the owners through every single stage of life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Boston Whaler here. So many people know that the brand was actually founded by Dick Fisher. Dick Fisher and Bob Pierce were friends growing up, and Dick Fisher and Bob Pierce went to school together, they went to college together, and they were also friends with Ray Hunt. Fisher and Pierce started the Fisher-Pierce Company, which made instruments. They actually started out, they made the first speedometer that they got a patent for is what developed the company, and then from there they actually got into electronics, switching, and other things. But Fisher was always a fan of the water. He was much more of a sailor than Pierce was, and his relationship with Hunt got him into multiple sailboats, raced a lot with Ray Hunt. But Dick Fisher was somebody who always had a passion for innovation. He was really intrigued by fiberglass, and this was something that was new in the industry at the time, but also foam and urethane products. plastics, and so he really wanted to find a way to develop a boat that was much more durable, and he had in his mind this idea to create a dinghy originally. Originally it was a sailing dinghy. The Alport there, that was something that he had. He loved sailing, so he was really trying to develop a dinghy that was kind of a motorboat, but a sailboat. The Squall that came out in subsequent years was something that I think was a true passion of his. But Hunt kept pushing him to kind of develop something that was, you know, a little bit more of a powerboat, something that had an engine that could be used. So this was some of the earliest photos of Fisher's prototype. This was around a 13-foot boat. You can see it still has kind of a boat tail to it, like a sailboat. This is when Fisher really got involved with Hunt and started, you know, working together with him, and they really started to try and plan and figure out what is the best hull design to develop, you know, a boat around. And the Hunt really drove Fisher to kind of lose the sailboat tail and kind of look at the Hickman sea skiff, which is one of, I would say, the predecessors to what the original Boston whaler became. Hickman himself, Albert Hickman, was involved with Hunt, was involved with Fisher, but he had a tremendous attitude when it came down to it. He was very set in his ways, very difficult to work with, and I would say probably about after a year of working with Hickman, Fisher and Hunt decided that it was time to split ways. But this is, you know, these are some of the original sea sleds, and you can kind of see, you know, you had the two outer sponsons, and there's no center sponson yet, which the original 13 had. The problem when Fisher and Hunt were working with this design, they were getting a lot of aeration in the outboard engines. And that was, Hickman said that the design didn't need to change. Hunt disagreed with him, yada, yada, yada. They decided to split ways, and Hunt started designing what would ultimately become the original 13-foot whaler. These are some of the original skiff drawings from Fisher Pierce, where they were still working on a hull that did not have a center keel. So they were yet to get to the center keel to a finalized design, but as they were finalizing production, they were also developing what would become the Unibond construction. And this is truly what makes whalers unique. Whalers today still have this technique in their manufacturing. What makes whalers so strong and unique is they have no stringers. They're not shoebox construction. They are a single piece. It's almost like a surfboard when you think about it. What they came up with and the way that they figured out to be able to keep these two hulls together is they use what were called shear blocks and shear braces in between the outer hull skin and inner hull skin. So these two skins came together in a mold that had a void, and then they would pour the foam in, and the foam actually adhered all of the hull skins to each other and created one structural solid member. And that's what the original patent was around the foaming process. So after they split ways with Hickman, the original, these are called the FP hulls, were developed. And this is when they finally came to a center keel. There's some really unique details on the 13 FP hulls, and these are Fisher Pierce prototypes. These are pre-productions. These started in around 1956 to 1957. If you ever find one of these, you are finding a true timepiece, you're finding a piece of history. Right now, the Whaler Factory, this is theirs, they have FP56. That was the oldest known until FP55, which is up there in the left, was found and restored by a guy in the northeast. FP58 is the hull that's up there at the top, and that is the oldest known whaler to exist. It's owned by a gentleman who does not want people to know where it is, but it's up in New England. That's the oldest known hull that exists right now. All of the FP hulls can be identified by multiple factors. The three handholds, which that made it into production, but the early production had the three handhold on the rear. But the one telltale is the through hole that goes through. This rear bulkhead does not drain. It only goes through the cockpit drain. And you can see there is kind of the relief on the bottom that has the weep hole that pulls water out. All of the whaler hulls are meant to be self-bailing. So when they start moving, if you take the plug out, it will suck all the water out and evacuate it out. There's no need for a bilge. So that center drain that's on the bottom side of the running surface is the one telltale detail that it is a early production, pre-production prototype hull. If you find one, let me know. splitting up. So Bob Pierce and Dick Fisher, they own Sigma Instruments together. And Bob Pierce actually got sick and tired of Fisher spending so much time with his passion of boats that he wanted to be bought out. So they split ways. So at that point in time, Dick Fisher took over all control of Boston Whaler. Hunt continued to develop the design to ultimately will become the final production 13. And they finalized all of the designs, and originally everybody thinks that Whaler started in 1958. That's not necessarily true. Whaler started about 1956, 1957, but the first time that they were sold to the public was the New York Boat Show in 1958. So that really was the inception of the final product that went to market. So what's in a name? Well, the name is actually kind of a play on words. Dick Fisher was a pretty good marketing guy when it came down to it. He was more than just an engineer and designer. Boston Whaler, he thought was an interesting name because Boston never had a whaling fleet. So he wanted people to be like, what the heck is this? What is this? And you know, through that kind of instinctual, well, I got to learn more. Let's go find out. That's why it was named that. So it still kind of has the sea sled and the harpoon, but he was an ultimate kind of marketing person when it came down to it. This was on the cover of Time magazine in 1961, and this is one of the most famous photos of Dick Fisher, of the boat being cut in half. He really wanted to develop something that was ultimately safe, unsinkable, and when this actually went to publish, it's when the brand really started to take off. He also did stunts like driving him up rivers and things like that, and Carl Kiekefer of Mercury had him come to the dealer meeting, cut a boat in half, put a Mercury outboard on the back, and actually run it for the dealers, which is interesting enough now that there's the connection with Mercury. So the original was the 13 Spore. You know, there's some great photos here. I found these actually on a family's blog. Every photo I have in here I've tried to credit, so it was a Hassler family blog. They bought this boat originally in 1959. This was Mom on the boat, but I think, you know, this kind of is quintessential Boston Whalerness. The blue hull, the 13 is what I think so many people kind of started out their boating adventures with and kind of have a draw to. And this was the first whaler to be released. The second boat that came into the whaler fleet was the 16. These are actual prototype drawings by a gentleman by the name of John Susio, who was an industrial designer in Connecticut. I can't tie him to Fisher, I can't tie him to Hunt, so I can only assume that he was probably contracted to do design work. But a lot of kind of this original design, I believe Hunt was still working on the hulls at that point in time. Fisher obviously had a very strong influence on that. And I'm not sure if they were having him work out interiors here, but there's some details here that you'll see in some of the later models, the Currituck and the Sakana and things like that. But there's some interesting things here too that, you know, the working in of storage in the stern, kind of the seats and the seating arrangement. So originally, this is the earliest I can find drawings that were of the development of the 16, and this was in 1960. In 1960 as well is when Bob Dougherty comes into the picture. Bob Dougherty was a shop teacher. He was a high school shop teacher who was at the Boston Boat Show and started a conversation with Dick Fisher and was enthralled with this idea of fiberglass, resins, foam, and the entire production process. And Fisher was kind of really struck by him and offered him a job right on the spot. So he went from a high school teacher to a boat builder in the blink of an eye and had a tremendous influence through the entire history of the company. So the world's first center console. Yes, I know some people feel the Aquasport was the first center console. The Aquasport came out, I think, in 1964. In the 1961 calendar year is when the Nausa and the Eastport were released. That was the first new model that Whaler released. It was a 16-foot. Even though it was 16.7, Whaler called it a 16. The interesting thing about Whaler, and as I go through all of the progression of the models, is for any given hull length, Whaler always used the same hull underneath it. It was the interior components that always changed, the cap, the console, and things like that. So the first boat after the 13 was the 16 Nauset in Eastport. And the only thing that differentiated these two apart was the Eastport had a full width stern seat and the Nauset did not. Both of them could be optioned with a 40-inch wide center console, but the standard was 36. And the Keynote, which came out in 1962, just after it, only used the 36-inch center console and then also had a forward casting platform. This was the first year as well that it had what was called the reversible pilot seat, the RPS, and that was the helm seat that actually has made its way through a lot of the classic years as well. A lot of people see any sort of wood center console whaler and immediately think it's a Keynote because it's the most recognizable name, I think, but it really is dependent upon what the interior configuration is as to what model it was. And it gets super confusing because you could order a Nauset with a rear seat, you could order a Keynote with a rear seat. So there were options to everything, but when it left the factory, this is typically how it would be delivered. The Currituck came later, and you can see this is kind of in vein with the drawings that John Susio was doing. The wood center console, low seating, wood interior. Again, this was still built on the 16 hull. This was a really nice one that the gentleman in the back actually owned. This is probably one of the nicest Curritucks that existed. He sold it because he didn't like bottom paint. That was his fault, but you can see it has a Bearcat on the back, and that was something that whaler actually had a touch in history in, and I'll get into that as well. So the Homelite Bearcat 55 and 85s are actually bought by Dick Fisher. I'll talk about that in the history, but it almost bankrupted the company, and Fisher ended up having to sell the company because of it. So the Squall came out in 1965, and again, I think this really was Dick Fisher wanting to get back to his sailing roots. He always wanted that dinghy. He wanted a dinghy that could be rowed, could have a small outboard put on it, or could be sailed. And the Squall lived on for many years. It was a popular model that people used as a tender, pulled behind boats, yachts, and things like that. The Katama was built again on the same 16 hull. This was the first fiberglass center console whaler that ever made. Low seating position, had a full helm seat with a seating pad and 2 bucket seats up front. This was in 1969. Some of the other things, details as well on this hull, the Minot is actually the same thing as a Katama, but it does not have the pilot seat, the padded pilot seat, does not have the console windshield and windscreen. But again, similar hull. The Menemsha came out in 1969 as well, and again, these hulls continue to be utilized time and time again. They are the foundational building blocks for every single model that whaler made. This was people call it the ugly duckling for a reason. It kind of does look like a duckling. But it's really a neat boat when it comes down to it. It has a raised pilot area, a nice windshield, but the interesting thing is it has 2 full 6.5-foot bunks in the front. It had a toilet that could be plumbed in there as well. So this was really an interesting and unique boat. Unsure what drove it, its development, whether Fisher wanted it, but it was something that you could overnight on. It was a great utility boat. So back to the Homelite. So the Homelite in 1969 is when it almost bankrupted Dick Fisher. So Dick Fisher bought all of the rights to the Homelite outboards, the 55s and the 85s, bought the production plant, took over ownership of it, and he had this envision of kind of what is called vertical integration in the marketplace today. He had the idea of, if I have an outboard and I have a boat, I can sell more outboards. And he was enthralled with this idea of a 4-stroke because it ran quieter. And he saw this as the future. Unfortunately, it was not the future. Nobody really grabbed onto it. Mercury had a really strong stronghold in the marketplace, and 2-strokes were just kind of continuing to live. This was a little bit too far out of the realm for what a lot of people wanted to get into, and unfortunately, all of the money that Fisher sunk into this purchase and getting the factories up to production cost him the company. And in 1969, he had to sell it to the CML group. So a lot of people are like, when Brunswick bought Whaler, Whaler wasn't Whaler anymore. Well, Whaler had been sold already in 1969 to the CML group. So Dick Fisher didn't even own the company after this point. So in the early 1970s is when Whaler wanted to start to develop a bigger boat once again. Dick Fisher was a fisherman at heart, and he wanted to take what was developed for the Nauset, Sakana, and Eastport, the small center console, and build something that was a little bit bigger. So the 21 Outrage was developed, and this was a unique boat when it came down to it because they split up the Unibond process. This entire boat from the gunnel down is basically a surfboard, and the cap on top is a fiberglass skin. If you go out to the 21 Revenge that's out there, you can see that. They weren't able to figure out how to get the foam all the way up into the gunnels at this point in time, so that's why they went with this production technique. So there are two non-smirked 21s that were produced. And this was the first hull that Bob Dougherty had a lot of influence on. And ultimately what he developed was the bow smirk as well. If you look at these hulls as well as the original 13s and 16s, they didn't have a smirk. And in rough water, if they pounded, they didn't have a way of deflecting the water out. So Bob Dougherty wanted to kind of develop this kind of bow shear line that connected the outer chines to the center line to help deflect water away. And the 21 Outrage was the first one with that. So talking a little bit about Bob Dougherty and his ultimate influence here. At this point in time, Fisher was late in his career and really wanted to give up the reins. He was kind of done, and he gave total control over to Bob Dougherty for design and engineering. One of the really unique things, and I do have this scale here, that Bob Dougherty did was, though he was a technical guy, he was an artist when it came down to it. The way he designed boats is pretty unique. He didn't start with chart paper and start at a scale. He started sketching boats inside profile, and what he felt was the right aesthetic. When he got the lines down, he would develop the front view, the top view, the back view, and then he would put a scale to it. So he never started with scale, he started by aesthetic, which is really unique. And then he developed these scales to go with every set of drawings. Unfortunately, when Bob Dougherty was let go, split ways with Whaler, ownership at the time wanted to get rid of everything that had to do with Bob Dougherty. They threw away all of his drawings, they threw away all of his scales. One of the draftsmen saved 2 of the scales from the trash, and this is one of the 2 that still exists.
Wow.
This one is up to 28, so I can assume that if this is Bob Dougherty's scale, this was probably used up to the 27-foot. This was for the 27-foot models. So in his ultimate paranoia too, the reason why he did that is because if any one of the engineers ever left with a set of drawings, if they didn't have the scale, nobody could figure out exact dimensions of the boats. So the Outrage comes into production, and it actually gets its name from Bill Mills, who was a friend and a canvas maker of Dick Fisher. Dick Fisher didn't have a name for this boat yet, and when he brought Mills over to see it, he brought him into the storage shed and showed it to him, and his first words were, "That's outrageous." And the name stuck. So that's where it comes from. Everybody's like, what does outrage mean? And it was literally through that conversation how it started. The original 21 Outrage, call it a dump truck, call it a ribside, call it what you want. This, again, was kind of what I was talking about, to where the bottom of the hull is one solid surfboard shape, and then the top is a cap. Fisher wanted the ribs, and 2008, when I met Bob Dougherty, gave me kind of a story behind this. He said Fisher wanted them because Fisher wasn't sure that the shape of the skin on the top, just being in a rounded profile, would be strong enough, that it wouldn't deflect. So he wanted the ribs that built into it, and Dougherty fought him because Dougherty said there's no way that these are going to come out of the molds, the shop guys are going to hate it, yada, yada, yada. It's developed this unique aesthetic that many of us really love. These boats have been super sought after, and there was a short production run of them. This is probably one of the nicest ones that exists. It's owned by a friend of ours, Larry Goltz. He's got it powered with twin Mercs. He's had a few of these, but this is really a flagship boat, and it's probably the best example in the world of this model. The interesting thing is hull number 1 is still in use. The Marine Biological Laboratories in Woods Hole, Massachusetts got hull number 1 from Dick Fisher. Dick Fisher, as much of a fisherman as he was, an engineer as he was, He was also an outdoorsman, and he also understood kind of like if you take care of the ocean, you take care of the sea, you take care of the environments that you boat in, it will take care of you. And Woods Hole Institute asked Whaler for a boat, and Fisher basically gave him hull number 1 for the cost of production. David Revinson, who used to run this program, he's since passed away, but he has all the documentation between the Marine Biological Laboratories and Dick Fisher of him wanting to give them this boat. And this boat's used still pretty much every single day today. It goes out, it does marine surveys, it takes samples. It's the icebreaker for the fleet. They actually use it in the wintertime to go out and break ice so the other boats can get out. So that's kind of a testament as well to Whaler's production. You know, if this still has been used like that for 50 years, I think it says a lot. In 1971, 1972 is when Dick Fisher retired. So that story that Bob Dougherty told me in 2008 was around the rib side. This is the first time I met Bob Dougherty, and I was talking to him, and I said, you know, the 21 Outrage is something that I absolutely love. And his words were, I hate that goddamn boat. And it was because of how much he fought Dick Fisher on it. And literally, the moment that Dick Fisher and his wife left the factory, Bob Dougherty ordered the top side molds of the 21 rib side to be cut up. And they went out and they cut them up, and that's when the 21 smooth side was developed. Some other interesting facts on that boat, if you look at the 21s, Dougherty designed it so that there are 2 sponsons that come off back, and the transom actually has a reverse cantilever to it. Talking to Dougherty, he designed it that way because he knew outboards are going to continue to get bigger and bigger and heavier. So he put that rear-facing transom brace on the hull to be able to accommodate them, so 20, 30, 40 years in the future they could have engines still on them and not really worry about the transom. So from that point on is when Bob Dougherty's signature smirk made its way onto all the hulls. In 1972, the 13 got it, and then they started to develop more hulls around the center console. All right, cool. So building off of the success of the 21 Outrage, the Nauset, the Eastport, they wanted to start to develop a greater product line within the center console range, and the Cohasset was the first one that was developed. This is the predecessor to the Montauk. This had a fiberglass center console. We in the community call it the lectern console. It looks like something that you would preach from at church. But it's a tremendous boat, has a lot of fishability because it's super open all the way around. Some of the other oddball models that they developed, 16 bass boat. This had a full cap on it. It had a stern deck that had a live well. It had casting seats up front. And they used this hull for a Tashmoo as well. And in 1973 is when Whaler lost their traditional white and blue coloring. After this point, it's when the tan hulls started to be developed. So if you see a hull that's out there that's white and blue, it's either 1972 or earlier. Some of them actually never made it into production in that classic colorway. The Tashmoo was very similar to the bass boat. It used the same gunnel cap, the same interior, except for it had a full width padded stern seat that went on the back. It was kind of much more of a day boat cruiser. In 1973 is when Bob Dougherty got his way, and this is the smooth side Outrage. You can see the ribs are gone. So this boat remained in production. They used the same running surface. They used the same hull, and then started putting the fiberglass consoles in that would make their way into the Montauk. The 19 Outrage was introduced at the same time. We call these in the community the banana boats, because if you look at them, that kind of sheer line of where the rub rail is, that's the split between the main hull and the cap. And that's just kind of an aesthetic that all of the whalers, the 19 and 21 whalers had in those years. So the first year of the Montauk was the 1973 calendar year, 1974 model year. This was built on the non-smirked hull. You can see it still has their traditional sponsons with the center keel up front. Before this, everybody seems to want to call a center console whaler a Montauk, but they didn't exist before 1973. In 1974, whalers started building cuddy cabin boats, and they were using the same exact hulls. Like I said, every single hull is the same, to develop different models. So they took the 21 Outrage and built the 21 Revenge, which used the same kind of outside gunnel cap, but then had the cutty up front. This boat is actually the one that's out back here. It's on the docks. Jim in the back used to own it, and it's owned by Griff, whose father actually bought this boat brand new, and now he's got it again. So it's been in the family ever since. And the 19 Outrage was the same way. They took the Outrage hulls and they built the top caps. So everything basically from the back of the windshield where it meets the gunnel forward is the same between the 21 and the 22. And they altered the shape to be able to meet the hull correctly. So basically, if you cut the top off of these two, they used the same molds for both hulls. The 11 was introduced in 1974, and this was one of the smallest boats they developed up to that time that was outboard powered. They wanted to develop something small that was a skiff that they could get towed easily behind boats of any size. That's why the 11 came out. And then the Newport. And the Newport was released in 1975, and basically they weren't selling very well the Tashmoos, the bass boats, and they wanted to kind of do an update to what was the Katama at the time. So they took the gunnel cap off of the Tashmoo and the bass boat and used that for this model, and then the console that's in this is an adaptation of the Katama. So this was kind of the blending of those two boats together. In 1975, Whaler had bought the hull molds from Highliner and had the Yankee Voyager. This was a 1 or 2 model year boat. This is the only traditional V-bottom boat in the classic era. It's tough to call it a Whaler. It had a Whaler, a decal on the side, but when it came down to it, it was a Highliner Gypsy. Whaler ultimately sold this boat mold to Nauset Marine, and Nauset Marine made it for a few more years, but the Whaler ownership was in 1975 and 1976. This boat is foam-filled, but it's not necessarily Unibond, and I would venture to say it probably could be sunk. I don't know anybody who's ever tried it. And in 1976 is when the 17 hulls came into production. And talking a little bit about what makes a smirked hull versus a non-smirked hull. In 1976, when the 17s were released, it was the same overall hull length as the previous years. It was 16 feet 7 inches. But Whaler decided to call it a 17 for 2 reasons. Number one, the 15 was introduced in 1976, and they felt in the portfolio there was too close of models, being a 15 and a 16. So they wanted to give more perceived separation between the incoming 15. And then they also did it to denote the hull change. So what the smirk is, again, these lines that come down from the center line to the outer sponsons and the chine and kind of connect it as a spray rail. Like I said, the 15 Sport came out in 1976. This is one of my favorite boats. I've owned 3 of them. They are just a tremendously fun, small boat. The 13 is a great boat for kids to learn on. When they get skills and you want them to go fast, the 15 was the boat. It was the hot rod. If you put it next to a Donzi, it's interesting. It has the same very flat shear line to it. It has a very raked smirk that comes all the way back. So it's a fast looking boat and it's a fun boat. It rides like it's on rails, it handles extremely well, and it goes, you're sitting basically right at the water surface. It's a tremendously fun boat. The 17 Sport came out as well. This was the Curatalk in previous years, so it used the same interior. And in 1976, Whaler released the low profile Outrage. This was a 19 Outrage that did not have the cap on it. There's a lot of people nowadays who will take a 19 Revenge or a 19 Outrage and remove the cap to create these. But Whaler actually produced this boat. The idea here was, I believe it was Paul Haru who kind of pushed for this, and Paul Haru was one of the guys who developed Commercial Products Division. Wanted a boat that could be used for life-saving, wanted a boat that could be used for on-water poling pots and things like that in and out of boats, so that's why they got rid of the gunnels. Whaler also built sailboats, and a lot of people don't realize this. They built multiple sailboats, the Harpoon series and the 5.2, the 4.6, and the 6.2 were all released in the late 70s. And they bought the molds and then developed them to be truly whaler. They are foam filled, and the 6.2 does have a full cabin. Not super fast boats, but they are really stable boats, great sailing. There's one of them on my lake that somebody sails. They have a 5.2. It's a pretty good boat. I'm not a sailor. I started as a power boater and then got into sailing later. I've never sailed one, but a few friends have, and they say they're quite enjoyable. Whaler ended up building a 9-foot tender as well in 1978. This is the smallest style Unibond kind of smirked hull that ever existed. It's an okay tender. It's a little tippy. It's good for small kids to learn on, but it wasn't a tremendous boat in my opinion. In 1978 was the launch of the V20 Outrage, and this was what became the classic series. At this point in time, Whaler had figured out how to be able to build a boat that was big enough that they could foam fill all the way up to the top gunnels. So gone are the caps that had the fiberglass molds, and this became kind of one singular Unibond hull like all of the other Whalers. The V20 was sold as a deep V hull. For the time it was, but it was still a pretty shallow dead rise, and not much more actually than the 21 and the 19. It had a hard ride to it, but was still a good boat. Started to pick up sales pretty well for Whaler. And then the 78, the V20 Outrage, Revenge was built off of the Outrage. Again, they were just taking that same cap and putting it on top. So the 22 Outrage was the next variation that came out after the V20. In the first production year, it was called, first couple production years, it was called the V20, then it became the 20 Outrage. In the 1979 model year when it came out, it actually had a red rub rail, the same as the V20. But this boat had an increased dead rise by about 4 more degrees, and this was starting to get Whaler into the bigger and bigger boats. Again, they built the Revenge model series off of the same hull in 1979. And in 1980, they released the V24 Outrage, which is also what is the 25 Outrage. At the time, this is the biggest Unibond hull. This was one of Dougherty's favorites. And there's later 25s that came out that did not use this hull. They actually expanded it and did what was called a wide body walk around. But the 25 Outrage, great boat. It's the biggest classic Outrage that exists. This is one from Italy. Italy was the largest non-US market, largest foreign market that Whalers were sold to. There was a company called Union Marine that imported them. And they did this kind of bow modification where the entire front bow was a padded lounge pad. They did that for all of them from 17 on up. The 25 Revenge was released in 1981, again built on the same hull as the Outrage. And then in 1980, Whaler started to move away from the traditional all-wood interior, and they wanted to build more fishing boats again. So the Striper was released both in the 15 and 17 models. So that's the model that I actually brought out there. It has a fiberglass side console and open seating. These were really meant to be fishing boats more than kind of anything else. Yes, you can call a classic or a super sport fishing boat, but these were designed to be completely walk around and fishable. And in 1981, they released the Frontier as well. Again, this was, at the time, built under the recreational products, but this ultimately became a commercial product. This was the first pilot house that they built, and again, I believe Paul Heroux, who started commercial products, was a big influence on the development of this. 1982 model year is when the 18 Outrage was released. This was a step up from the 17 Montauk. It's a bigger boat. This actually was a good boat that could be trailered behind a small car. You didn't need a full-size vehicle to do it. Gave you a lot of capability. So built off of the same aesthetics as the V20, 22, and 25. Very sought-after boat still today. Whaler did make inflatable boats in 1983 for a short period of time. Actually, Toyo Tires, who exists today, they were the manufacturer of these out of Japan, which was kind of an oddity, but yes, there was that craze of when Zodiac and Achilles and others started bringing boats as tenders, and Whaler tried to get into the market. If you find one today and it still holds air, congratulations, not many of them do. built off of those same Outrage hulls came the the Revenge Cuddy. And this was a 22 or 25 hull that had a cuddy cabin up front with a windscreen and a forward helm that attached to the cuddy station. This was ultimately the same mold that was used for the center console Outrage. So basically, they're the same boat, but what Whaler did was they removed the helm from the bulkhead up front, put a center console in, and it has the same cabin space up front. Another oddball that not a lot of people have heard of are the GTX model. So this was, again, in the early 80s, Whaler was trying to get more into the bow rider market. It was something that was taking place. So they took an 18 Outrage hull and developed a bow rider. This came in both an IO and an outboard models. But it was their kind of foray to try and go after small sea rays and runabouts. In that same vein, Whaler also took the 18 Outrage and for a short production run made an 18 Newport, which took a 17 Newport console, put it into an 18 hull. This one has a full sun pad up top, but again, these are some low production boats. You only saw them in in the 1983 model year. So they were short production runs. The Super Sport came out in 1983, and the difference between this and the Sport was you had a full seat back with storage at the helm. You had a seat back up front of the helm, and then you had the full wraparound rails. 13, 15, and the 17 all came in the Super Sport models. And then Whaler also introduced the the center console Sport, which was the only 15 that had a rigging tunnel in it. They took a Montauk console, cut it down by 9 inches, and then used that as a center console for the 15. 1983 also saw the introduction of the 27 Whaler. This was the biggest Whaler and still is the biggest Whaler that they ever produced in the classic line. It is kind of a unique boat because it didn't necessarily use the same style of production that they did with the 20, 22, and 25. This boat does have a drop-in floor that goes into the cockpit. It came in a single or 3 fuel tank configuration. And it took a lot of development of them trying to figure out the foam process to be able to do this, because this boat, it doesn't necessarily have stringers, but it has different dimensional elements underneath it that were very difficult to fill with foam, and they get it to flow all the way up into the gunnels. Whaler also made the Super Cat, which again gets back to the sailing heritage. Every once in a while, a Whaler sailboat came into the marketplace. They made this in I believe a 17 and a 20. The 20 is an extremely fast boat. I have a friend who has raced both of them. The 20 takes 2 people and it takes all of your attention. It will throw you out. It was faster than the Hobies of the time. Really an interesting boat, but again, an oddball for Whaler. It didn't necessarily sell well or resonate well with the people who are truly interested in Whalers. Continuing on through the 80s, they developed the Walk-Around Revenge series. They had a very difficult time. They got a lot of complaints from customers in the earlier Revenges. Trying to get up to the bow was absolutely impossible. You could not get around the outside of the windscreen. There was no walkable surface. You had to go up through the hatches. So what they designed was the Walk-Around series, which in the center companionway has a staircase that pulls out, and you're able to walk up through the windshield, which opens, and then kind of like a sailboat, you've got that whole pulpit to walk all the way out to, and you had rails on both sides of you. So it was a protected walkable surface all the way out. 86 was the center console cuddy. A lot of people call this an Outrage. It's not. There was never a 27 Outrage. So they continued to develop this boat. If you've ever been on one, it's a tank of a boat. It's extremely wide, very stable boat. This was, like I said, the largest classic that was introduced. In 1986 as well is when they developed the Whaler Drive. Dougherty knew outboard propulsion was becoming more and more powerful. He wanted to find a way to extend the running surface of the boat without doing an entire new mold. So Armstrong at the time, Armstrong brackets existed, but the difference between what Dougherty designed and Armstrong bracket is the Whaler Drive is a wetted surface. It actually increases the overall running surface of the boat, where an Armstrong bracket back in the day has a flotation bracket. When the boat comes up on plane, that's no longer in the running surface. So Dougherty felt like that was a better option, and those who ride on them do say it is a tremendous difference that you notice between a notch transom and a full transom model with the Whaler drive. Whaler continued to make improvements on the 13s and 15s in various interiors. They did the Super Sport Limited, which was a drop-in fiberglass interior, all the way through up the model line. And then in the 87, 88 model years, they introduced the Mischief. There was a red Mischief out there. Their low production numbers, Jim, what was it, 250 some were made? They came in red, white, and desert tan. Desert tan was extremely rare, so was the white. Red is much more prevalent. But this was a 15 hull that they developed and wanted to do kind of a sport boat out of. If you go look at it, it's got 2 bucket seats. It has a nice bench seat. It's a fun little boat. But also, during those years, there's a desert tan one with a red one. You can see well-appointed interior. In the late 80s, Miami Vice was in its heat. Everybody wanted to go fast boat, and this was Whaler's foray into kind of developing those sport boats. The Temptation 20, 22, and 25 were developed, and these were all attempts to kind of go after that somewhat go fast market, but still provide a family cruiser. There's a sizable cabin in this boat, and all of them featured a closed transom Whaler drive, where you can see this is how the extended running surface works. So they were all closed transom, and if you didn't get an outboard version, they did sell them in IOs. So in 1989, CML decided to sell Whaler to Reebok, the shoe company. And this was kind of the turning point of what became the end of the classic years. At this point in time, Reebok had this idea that to kind of broaden their market share, they were going to start buying outdoor companies that made everything from canoes, kayaks, boats, hiking gear, and stuff like that. So the reason why they bought Whaler is they felt that it could expand their kind of market share of outdoor products. And that's when the final years of the Dougherty generation came into play. The 27 walk-around was built on the 27 hull, and the 25 walk-around was the last hull that Dougherty got to see go into production when he was at Whaler. This boat is what got Dougherty fired. The Reebok ownership, Paul Fireman was the leader of Whaler at the time, president of Whaler. He wanted Bob Dougherty to design a Grady White. Bob Dougherty was very set in his ways and said, I'm going to continue to design the boats that I've always designed. This is actually Bob Dougherty's 25. He and Paul Fireman got on the boat at Bob Dougherty's house. They went across the channel and they got into an argument next to a Grady White. Scott Wood, who was one of Bob Dougherty's engineers, tells the story. He's like, I was 300 yards away and I could hear the two of them screaming at each other. They came back, both of them were red-faced, got off the boat, and a few days later is when Bob Dougherty came into Whaler, packed up his stuff, and left. After that, his boats continued to be released. The 31 was released, which was a Bob Dougherty design, and the 27 Offshore was released. The 17 Outrage, all of these boats were under development during Dougherty, but released after his departure. So his team of engineers kind of split ways as well. Scott Wood was one of his lead engineers who ended up staying, and then Peter Van Lanker, who came to Whaler. He's been at Chris Craft, Hinckley, Hunt. He made his way there after Whaler. He came from Blackwatch to Whaler, took over kind of the development and production run of all of Dougherty's final designs into production, and that's what led into the post-classic years. And the 27 Offshore was the last Dougherty hull that was released. In 1993, Meridian took ownership from Reebok. Reebok has almost bankrupted the company. Unsure why Meridian bought them. It was probably to broaden their portfolio, to get access to patents. Unsure why, but the one thing that they did do was, in 1993, they ceased all operations in the Boston area and made the announcement that they were moving to Edgewater, Florida. Shortly after that, all the production moved down to Florida, and that's where Whaler currently is. Today, Brunswick does own Boston Whaler. They bought Boston Whaler in 1996 for around $26 million, which doesn't seem like a whole lot at the time. But the interesting thing that, I argue with people today who say that Whaler today is not what it used to be. It is, and I truly believe that Whaler is still here today because of Brunswick's investment in the company. Without Brunswick, they would have gone out of business after Meridian, quite honestly. Nobody wanted them. The saltwater market was not a marketplace that anybody believed in. There was large cruisers kind of dominating the marketplace, and Brunswick had ownership of Sea Ray and saw an opportunity to broaden their portfolio into the saltwater marketplace. And that's why they bought Whaler. Ultimately, they own Mercury as well. They saw that as being better for vertical integration. But they bought Whaler and they took a chance on Whaler. They brought Sea Ray management in at the time, which caused a whole bunch of infighting. But ultimately, Whaler was able to stand on its own. And in my career, I do automotive marketing and consulting. And I happened to be working with Brunswick in 2008 in a meeting with all of the heads of the saltwater brands as well as Sea Ray at Brunswick, and we were there auditing their boat show experiences and things like that. And at the time, the marketing director, George Niels, said, there's going to come a point in time when Sea Ray is going to be irrelevant, and Whaler will be the dominant brand in our portfolio. And literally, people started laughing at him in that, and that was in 2008. Shortly after that is when Sea Ray started losing market share, and the saltwater market has taken off. Today, center consoles dominate the marketplace, and it's because of Brunswick's investment in the company at that time. Kept them afloat, kept them on life support, built a foundation, and now builds the products that exist today. Honestly, the brand recognition that's there today benefits us as classic owners. We get value out of that because they still make a great product, and the brand today still gets great brand recognition and value out of it because there are people like me and others who have classics that are still on the water. That says a tremendous amount for the brand. A lot of people say, but what would Dick Fisher do? He'd roll over in his grave. He would not be happy with where the company is today. I beg to differ. When it comes down to it, Dick Fisher was a businessman, and he wanted his brands to succeed. It nearly cut his heart out when he had to sell the company to CML. So I believe today, with Fisher being the businessman that he was, he would see the marketplace, understand it, and understand that you have to keep developing bigger boats to meet the marketplace, because that's what it is today. When it comes down to it, yeah, you do make a lot more money off of building a bigger boat than a smaller boat, but Whaler still does make small products all the way through the 42 Outrage, and they ultimately have to go bigger because that is where the marketplace is. You look at HCB, Yellowfin, and others that are going up in the 50, 60-foot range. You have to get there, and I believe that's what Fisher would be doing and trying to do if he was still alive and running the company today. So that is kind of the history of it. People wonder what came out of the classic years. I put this up there. Bob Dougherty went on to found Dougherty Marine, which ultimately became Edgewater. Sold Edgewater, and then after his non-compete, went and built Everglades. Sold Everglades, kind of built Everglades mostly with his son. Stephen Dougherty was around for the original years of Dougherty Marine and Edgewater when they built Everglades. That was Bob's kind of last real hurrah. They started Solus Boats, but Bob passed away shortly after Solus Boats was founded, and now Stephen Dougherty runs that. So that is kind of the lineage of Bob Dougherty. Paul Haru, who started commercial products and was influential in kind of making commercial products in its own division within Whaler, decided in '93 when they were moving production to Florida that he didn't want to move, and that's when he started Maritime Skiffs. So if you look at a maritime skiff today, there are a lot of telltales to how the pilot house is designed, the decks are laid out, things like that. They basically are a Whaler without a bowsprit when it comes down to it. So he continued on that sort of Whaler lineage. So these are the boat brands that exist today that kind of came out of the classic years of Whaler. And that's it. Thank you all Thank you all for your time. I know that it's a long presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like an early 13-foot or 16-foot Whaler is a lot lighter than a later one. What made it heavier Was there a reason to make it heavier?
So the post-classic ones, I mean, the whole design changed, they got heavier. Later years of production, they changed the bulkhead in the stern, they changed it to kind of a sink-style splash well, they made the transom taller. There were a few things, they're not tremendously that different when it came down to it. The weight of the hulls through the classic years didn't vary probably more than 100 pounds, I would say, from the initial 15-inch transom, non-smirked hull, all the way through the ones that were built in the early 2000s with the 20-inch transom, sink-style splash well, and smirked bow. Just a few production changes, not much else other than reinforcement here and there, like I said, transom design and things like that.
Is the newest Montauk a little wider than the older Montauk?
The current Montauk, which is the second generation of the post-classic hull, is closer to an 18 Outrage. It is wider, in overall length it's slightly over 17 feet, but it's, I think, almost 9 inches wider than the classic Montauk. It has an internal fuel tank too, which used to separate the Montauk series from everything else.
Yeah.
The Montauk always had on-deck fuel tanks, and the new series has it built in.
With the promo picture where they're cutting through the hull of the boat, was the guy in the water cutting that, or did they actually start cutting through and then leave the saw midway?
I actually don't know how they did that cover.
I've seen the picture 1,000 times, and I'm like, who's the poor guy standing in the water cutting the boat in half?
Yeah, I'm not really sure if they sawed it on land and put it on water for the photo, but yeah, it looks like somebody's under the boat sawing it.
Yeah, because he's not topside.
No, they've done plenty of, so they do take production boats that fail production. Whaler won't send a boat out of the shop if it's under 5% or greater than 10% of what the published weight is supposed to be. So if the boat is light, it didn't have a full foam fill. If it's heavy, something odd happened. And those are the demo boats that they use to cut up now. So if you see one, you know, they take them to dealer meetings and things like that. They'll cut them up in the water. But those are boats that did not pass final inspection at the factory.
Can you talk a little bit about how they actually did that production? Or they just have two molds sitting together, or the two fiberglass parts, and then insert the foam and allow it to expand?
So the original patent and the way it's talked about, and it's still very similar today, they lay up the exterior hull skin in a mold that's in a jig that has clamps all the way around it. They lay up the interior cockpit mold the same way. So you have the two skins that are done, and it's a clamshell production. They pick them up, put them together, and then there's clamps that go all the way around. The shear braces that I talked about, those are placed in the hull, and they have other techniques that they use now, but that keeps the dimension the same, the necessary dimension the same between the exterior and interior hull skins. Those are glued together, and then they pour the foam in, and the foam runs up, and they have vents that go all the way around the hulls, and that's how it's done. The hulls are laid up in the actual jig that they use for the foaming process.
How many places do they ship the foam?
Whaler has tried to stay with a one-shot process through all of the classics were always done in a one-shot mold. Some of the post-classics now, they're in 2 and 3 shots. I'm friends with a lot of people at the factory. It's difficult to get those foam shots to be consistent when you're filling them from different spots at different rates, and you know you're hoping they expand all at the same time. It's a exact science when it comes down to it. They have to play a lot with mixtures and things like that. And you're in Florida using a waterborne urethane that uses water as a catalyst, so humidity plays a big role in kind of how all of that goes. So it's an interesting process. I've been there for them.
The
Shooting
air has
smalls.
to get out as well, right? I mean,
So yeah, the air has to get out. What they developed, and if you have an old whaler that you're restoring and it has polypropylene line or it has metal conduit in the gunnel surface, that's there because that's an vent. And Whaler did that, so as it started to foam up, if an area is expanding quicker than another, that actually acts as a place for it to press against and not compress, and allows air to continue to escape out of those voids until all of the air is out, and then it starts to flow out and foam out. So if you're restoring an old whaler and you're wondering why that conduit is in there, that's why it is.
Jeff, take a few more questions and also.
Yeah. Go ahead. Somebody else had a question?